Welcome back. Last lecture we introduced Thomas Aquinas. I gave you a little bit on his life and a very brief overview on his works, very brief in the light of how massive his works were. In this particular lecture, I'm going to spend a little time on the subject of Aquinas' theological method. And once again, let me just get to that. With Aquinas, there is something of a turning point on the matter of theological method, particularly the use of reason in philosophy. Now, we saw that with Abelard, he basically reinforced that as the central issue or debate about which the Middle Age theology revolved. It had actually gone back, of course, to Augustine, and was influenced a great deal by some of the other individuals we've seen, Dionysius and Boethius. But with Aquinas, the question of the relationship between reason and philosophy really reaches its high point. So some preliminary points here before we proceed. First, the use of philosophy in doing theology has been a thing. It's been happening. We've been sort of tracking this ever since we had the lectures on Justin Martyr, Origen, Augustine, and even Tertullian. Remember, Tertullian was the one that said you shouldn't be using philosophy in trying to do theology. What has Jerusalem to do with Athens? That's Tertullian. And yet he did use philosophy quite a bit. Second, the use of philosophy in the Trinitarian and Christological debates that we saw earlier was both problematic and beneficial. We saw that with Arius, and Arianism used Greek philosophy, but then the Cappadocians used it to clarify the philosophical language that largely led to the solution of those debates. The philosophy that dominated through these centuries, right up through Eriugena, as we've seen, was Neoplatonism, again mediated through Boethius and Pseudo-Dionysius. Even Anselm, with his method of faith-seeking understanding, used reason and philosophy, but was in a way that was doing theology, but from the standpoint of faith first, then reason and philosophy. So it wasn't like Anselm was going back to something, again, that Tertullian had said. That's not what faith-seeking understanding means, but faith means you start with faith, you start with what Scripture says, and you can use reason, but you never let reason sort of override your understanding of the Bible, because that's always first. With Aquinas, the philosophy of Aristotle began to play a significant part in doing theology, although the influence of Neoplatonism had never really been lost. So let's talk about theology and reason in philosophy. The exact nature of theology in Thomas Aquinas and its relation with philosophy is frankly something of a controversial issue. Some have argued, quite rightly, that Thomas's two Summa are theological works to the core. Thomas explicitly states in the Summa Theologia that God is the proper subject and matter of theology. So it seems like Aquinas there is sort of being Anselmian in a way. Let's make sure we start with God. This is not to say that it does not deal with other issues, such as, for instance, things or signs, an obvious reference to Peter Lombard's way that he structured his principles of the sentences, but the theologian treats of these other things only insofar as they have relation to God. As Thomas sees it, a theologian is somebody who has a theocentric focus. That does not mean, as we will see, that a theologian cannot use arguments, as in the 5 ways. And again, I've given you the notes on a lecture for 5 ways, but I'm not going to make a video on those, so you can read those over for yourself. That is, the theologian cannot, it doesn't say that a theologian cannot use arguments. How do theology and philosophy differ for Aquinas? Theology begins with God. Philosophy begins with creatures and creation. Again, that in and of itself is a sort of Aristotelian sort of notion. The idea is that you You keep them separate. For Thomas, theology, Sacra Doctrina, and philosophy have a different focus, as he explains in Summa Contra Gentiles, whereas the philosopher focuses on creatures first and is then led to a consideration of God. The first consideration of the theologian is God, and the theologian examines creatures only in relation to God. And so, again, this is sort of an Aristotelian way of doing things. You can separate them, and you sort of approach them on their own terms. Thomas's understanding of theology remains indebted to the Anselmian Fideis Quorum's intellectum we saw. Theology uses human reason not to prove faith, but to make manifest some implications of its message. Natural reason should assist faith, as the natural bent of the will ministers to charity. A quotation from Summa Theologica. Thomas therefore sees philosophy and theology in harmonious terms. Although the scope of theology is more universal and broader than any of the other sciences. Indeed, it was in the Middle Ages, they thought of theology as the queen of the sciences. It was on top. Theology is distinctive, and then it looks at things from the perspective of God's self-revelation. But again, philosophy starts, with what we can see. It starts with dealing with creatures, starts with the world around us, whereas theology deals with things that are revealed to us from God. And the key here is that Thomas thought you could have both. You could sort of keep one going while the other was going, and they don't necessarily get mixed up. Aquinas thought the theologian can sometimes use arguments from other disciplines, that is philosophy, to illustrate a theological point, just as the philosopher can use arguments from other disciplines, namely like physics or science, to make his philosophical point. Similarly, philosophy can be used to demonstrate the preambles of faith, such that God does exist. This is the key to his understanding of the five ways. Or it can be used to refute assertions that are contrary to the faith by showing them to be false or lacking necessity. So you could use philosophy or logic to sort of show your opponents cannot be true, but you're not necessarily arguing directly for theological or biblical propositions. You're just using philosophy in a way to argue against other views. Theology is necessary because of the limits of reason and philosophy. That's kind of a key point. So his point was you can never really get to things you need to get to with philosophy or reason alone. So there's always a necessity for having theology. Thomas explained that it was necessary for our salvation that there should be a body of knowledge revealed by God in addition to philosophical researches. There are a number of reasons for this. First, because the Christian understanding of God as a Trinity and other core truths of the Christian faith are beyond the grasp of human reason. And we've already kind of seen that when we were talking about the Trinity with Augustine. You probably felt that was beyond our human reasoning. But there are certain things that we just have to have God tell us that there is a Trinity. We wouldn't be able to figure that out by looking at the world around us or using our own reason. Or even things like our salvation needs to be revealed to us, because that's not something that we would figure that out on our own either. Second, even as regard those truths about God which human reason could have discovered, it was necessary that man should be taught by a divine revelation. So there are things that we can figure out, again, such as God exists or the immortality of the human soul, Thomas would say. But we could figure those out on our own by reason. But it's better that God reveals them to us so that we know we got the right answer when we figure them out philosophically. That's basically his idea here. It was necessary that man should be taught by divine revelation because the truth about God, such as reason could discover, would only be known by a few, and after a long time and with the admixture of many errors. So in order to make sure that even those things we can know, we know truly, we need God's revelation. While Thomas sees the relationship between philosophy and theology in harmonious terms, he is emphatic in stating that we should resist any attempt to reduce theology to philosophy. It would be an error to include the content of faith within the bounds of philosophy, as would happen should somebody decide to believe nothing but what could be established by philosophy. On the contrary, philosophy should be brought within the bounds of faith. As the apostle says in 2 Corinthians 10:5, we take every We take every thought captive to obey Christ. So basically what Thomas is saying here is, again, he's very Anselmian. You start with faith, seeking, understanding, but you can use philosophy. You can use it as long as it stays within the bounds of the content of faith, within the bounds of life should happen. Should somebody decide to believe nothing, messed that up. Anyway, philosophy should be brought within the bounds of faith. That's the part of the quote I was trying to read again. So we start with faith and we use philosophy, but we don't let philosophy take us away from the faith. That's what I was trying to say. So how can we know about God? It's not so much of an exaggeration to say that Thomas spent his whole life trying to answer that question. How can we know about God? Aquinas recognizes two distinct sources of knowledge, reason and revelation. So there are two ways of human beings can come to know things through their own intellect and observational powers by being directly told by God. We might say that for Aquinas, Aristotle represents the first way, and Paul the second way. However, the two sources of our knowledge are not equally important. Reason can teach us a great deal, but not everything we need to know for salvation. Only revelation can supply that. But what reason teaches us is nevertheless true. Reason and revelation do not contradict each other. Both are ultimately gifts from God. Given the distinction between philosophy and theology, one can then distinguish between philosophical and theological sources and influences in Aquinas' work. As a philosopher, Thomas is emphatically Aristotelian, as we've said. His interest in and perceptive understanding of Aristotle is present from his earliest years and did not await the period toward the end of his life when he wrote close textual commentaries on Aristotle. In other words, some scholars have thought that, Aquinas only became Aristotelian later when he started working with texts from Aristotle. But that's not quite true. He was influenced by Aristotle very early on, and you can see it in much of his writing, particularly, of course, in the two Summa. When Thomas referred to Aristotle as the philosopher, and in his writings, it's interesting, he almost never uses Aristotle's name. He just refers to him as the philosopher. He was not merely adopting a way of speaking at the time. He adopted Aristotle's analysis of physical objects his view of place, time, and motion, his proof of the prime mover, his cosmology. He adopted all of these and he made them his own. He made his own Aristotle's account of sense perception and intellectual knowledge. His moral philosophy is closely based on what he learned from Aristotle. But to acknowledge the primary role of Aristotle in Thomas's philosophy is not to deny other philosophical influences. Augustine is a massively important presence in Aquinas' work. Boethius, Pseudo-Dionysius, you can see why we spent some time talking about those guys. You probably have never heard of them, but they're vital for understanding a giant of theology like Thomas Aquinas. There's nothing more obviously Aristotelian about Thomas than his assumption that there is something to be learned from any author, and only mistakes are to be and not only mistakes to be avoided. He definitely adopted many features from non-Aristotelian sources. How should we evaluate Aquinas' method? Aquinas would probably say we should not try to prove the basic truths of revelation, God is Trinity, the Incarnation, etc., in a rational manner. Although we can argue from revealed truths, we will not be able to prove in a positive fashion the truth of revelation. However, we should remember that Thomas has more confidence in human reason when it comes to the establishing the preambles of faith that many would today. He holds, for instance, the view that we can prove God's existence from the created world. Hence, once more, those 5 ways. Aquinas also is known for his view of analogy when speaking of God. What he's saying there is, this goes along with what we were just talking about, it's a new topic, but God is known by analogy. Univocal, totally the same, knowledge of God is impossible, since our knowledge of God is limited. So you can see, remember Eriugena said we can't know anything about God, going back to some previous theologians. Thomas said, well, we can't know everything exhaustively about God, but we can know some things true about God in a analogous way. So univocal means totally the same. No, we can't do that. Equivocal means totally different, and the knowledge of God is impossible, since creation since creation only resembles the Creator. So it's not the same thing. So that we know things about things, but God knows things about things more directly than we do. Because of the great differences between God and creatures, the way of negation is necessary, and we talked about that earlier as well. Two words are used analogically if their respective meanings are in some sense both similar and different. In the two sentences, my home is in Chicago, that used to be true. A gopher's home is underground. The word home is partly the same in both and partly different. So that's why it's not univocal. It's not exactly the same thing, and it's not totally. It's equivocal because there are some differences. According to Thomas, no words that apply, human words that apply to God, can be used in a univocal sense. God is transcendent and infinite. The categories by means of which humans attempt to describe him are drawn from our human experience in the imperfect world. Therefore, whatever words we use to describe God are at best analogically true of him. This is the point. So his method is that we can say true things about God, but when we say those things, they are only analogical. They're true, but they only reach a certain level of understanding. Well, that was I tried to be a little too quick on that recording, but nevertheless, it's there. So we will stop for now. Again, there are two sets of notes, one on Aquinas' 5 ways, and another on Aquinas' substance theory. And I would encourage you to read through that. That's a little heavy, philosophical. That's why I didn't make a recording of it. But the key there is that Aquinas' understanding of substance theory is really what's using Aristotle's view is what's behind the Roman Catholic understanding of transubstantiation and what goes on in the Eucharist or the communion. So I would encourage you to make sure you read through both of those to get a little Thomas Aquinas on the philosophical side, and to understand some Thomas Aquinas on the theological side, particularly with respect to understanding the Roman Catholic Mass and its understanding of what's called transubstantiation. You'll read about that in those notes. All right, well, that's it for now, and we'll see you next time.